Have you ever wondered why so many gacha protagonists feel so bland? Why, despite playing completely different gachas, the protagonist often feels like the same character just with a different face? There are two major reasons for this. The first one is the self-insert, and I'm not going to spend much time on that because I think most people already understand that concept. The second reason, however, is something people almost never talk about, and that is the existence of a male and female protagonist. Despite the fact that giving the player more choice sounds like an objectively good thing, it can create a very interesting problem. The more versions of the protagonist a game has to accommodate, the less freedom the writers have to make that protagonist a specific person/character. And that is what I want to talk about today, the personality problem. Now let's go right ahead into the most obvious problem, and that is the protagonist themselves. When a game allows you to choose between a male and female version of the protagonist, the writers have to make sure that the same character works regardless of which option you choose. The protagonist needs to fit the same story, with the same dialogue, relationships, emotional moments, and the same general personality, and that creates a problem. Obviously, there's exceptions to this, and we'll get into that later. Because on the other hand, when you create one specific protagonist, you can make them much more distinct. The protagonist can be arrogant, shy, they can even be more feminine or masculine, but when the player can choose between two different versions of that character, the writers have to ask themselves, will this personality work for both of them? And that will end up pushing the protagonist towards something much more neutral, something broadly likable. And to be clear, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing by itself. A female protagonist can be masculine, a male protagonist can be feminine. The problem is when the same archetypes start appearing over and over again. The female protagonist often feels like a tomboy in terms of personality, while the male protagonist often feels like a overall masculine guy. But eventually, you start wondering, are these characters actually being written as individuals, or are they both being designed as the safest possible version of a protagonist that the largest number of players, both male and female, can accept? And this is where games like Wuthering Waves start entering the conversation. You can choose between male rover and female rover, and whichever one you choose becomes your protagonist. The other version doesn't appear in the story at all, but the game still has to make sure that the story works regardless of which version of rover you choose. The same scenes need to make sense, the same relationships need to work, and the same personality needs to fit both versions of the character. Other games approach the idea differently. Zenless Zone Zero, for example, allows both Wise and Bell to exist within the story, and this is a game that does this pretty well since they both have different personalities depending on who you choose. Sometimes even some cutscenes having both of them in the same positions with their same personality regardless of who you chose. But even then, the relationships between the protagonist and the characters remain overall the same despite their difference in personality. But regardless of the exact system, the fundamental problem remains the same. The more versions of the protagonist the writers need to accommodate, the more careful they have to be about making the protagonist too specific, because it would make the other version of the protagonist feel like it was not meant to be. And that brings us to the second problem that I've been teasing a little: relationships. Now this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Imagine that your game has a male and female protagonist, and then you have a character that develops a close relationship with the protagonist. Depending on which protagonist the player chooses, that same relationship can now exist in multiple different ways. Male protagonist and female character, female protagonist and female character, male protagonist and male character, female protagonist and male character. The same character relationship now has to work in all of those scenarios, and that can make it much harder for the writers to make a clear decision about what that relationship actually is. Is it romantic? Is it just platonic? Maybe a close friendship? Is it intentionally ambiguous? 99% of the time, writers have to choose choose ambiguity. And that ambiguity is a consequence of the system itself. Because if the same relationship has to work regardless of the protagonist's gender, then the writers can't necessarily make every relationship specific. And for games developed in China, there can be additional complication. China has regulations and regulatory risks that can make the explicit portrayal of those kinds of romantic relationships more difficult for games developed and published there. Now, this doesn't mean that gay characters are completely impossible in Chinese media. The situation is more complicated than that, but developers can still face regulatory and commercial risks when portraying certain relationships explicitly, and that creates an incentive to be careful. The game overall can just say that both characters are very close, and that's basically it. They might flirt, they might hold hands, they might have incredible chemistry, they might even have scenes that can be interpreted as romantic, but the game never has to actually commit to what the relationship is, because it's holding itself back with a dual protagonist system. It is where the choice between male and female protagonists makes the situation even more complicated, because the relationship needs to work regardless of which protagonist the player chose. And this brings us to Silver Palace. From what we've seen so far, the game appears to give players a lot more freedom when it comes to interacting with the characters. You can go on encounters with characters, you can interact with them in different ways, and you can even hold hands with characters regardless of whether he shows the male or female protagonist. And for a lot of people, this is exactly what they want from a game. More freedom, more choice, more ways to interact with the characters they like. And I understand that. But this system also demonstrates the problem I'm talking about. The more flexible the protagonist is, the more flexible the relationships have to become as well. The game can let you get close to everyone, but it becomes much harder for the story to definitely say what any of those relationships actually are. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying that Silver Palace is necessarily doing something wrong. We still need to see how the final version of the game actually comes out, but the concept demonstrates the trade-off perfectly. You can give the player more freedom to define their relationships, but in exchange the writer may have less freedom to define the relationships themselves. And that is the fundamental problem with this entire design philosophy. The advantage of a specific protagonist. Now let's compare this to a game like Nikkei. In Nikkei, you play as the commander. The protagonist is a specific character, is male, and it immediately gives the writers a much more specific framework to work with. If the writers want a female character to be romantically interested in the commander, they can do that. If they don't want another character to be interested in him, they can do that, if they want to. Basically, the writers don't have to make every relationship compatible with every possible version of the protagonist. They can actually make decisions, and it is something that people sometimes forget. A specific protagonist gives the writers more freedom, because the writers know exactly who this character is, they know their gender, their personality, their background, they know what kinds of relationships make sense for them, and because of that, they can make more specific focused choices. Now obviously that doesn't mean that every character in Nikkei has to be romantically interested in the commander, even though they are. But the point is that the writers can make that decision freely. Some relationships are romantic, some aren't, some are platonic, and some are complicated. The important thing is that the writers can actually make those decisions, and that oftentimes leads to a higher quality story and experience. They don't have to make every relationship compatible with every version of the player character. And that is the trade-off. You might lose some player choice, but you gain more authorial freedom. Love and Deep Space. And we can see the same thing from the opposite perspective with Love and Deep Space. The game is specifically designed around a female audience. You play as a female protagonist, and the entire game is built around the fantasy of interacting with its male characters. If the game suddenly allowed you to choose a male protagonist, technically that would give players more choice, but it would also fundamentally change the fantasy that the game is trying to sell. the game would no longer be designed around that audience. The experience would be very different. And I think this is why Love and Deep Space works so well for the audience that it's targeting. It knows exactly who it is for, it doesn't try to be everything for everyone. But yeah, despite all the drama, we can't really deny that Love and Deep Space had a pretty good run and they knew what they were doing. And it brings us to a much broader question. Is appealing to everyone actually a good thing? The problem with appealing to everyone. Obviously, there are advantages to having both a male and a female protagonist. You can offer players more representation, more choice, and you can potentially appeal to a broader audience. And from a business perspective, the last point is probably the most important. Companies want more players. More players means more potential customers. So why wouldn't a company want to make a game appealing to as many people as possible? The problem is that the more you try to appeal to everyone, the more compromises you may have to make. Your protagonist has to be compatible with more people. Your relationships have to work for more people. Your story has to avoid alienating more people. And eventually, you can end up with a game that is technically designed for everyone, but emotionally it feels like it was designed for nobody in particular. And it is especially dangerous in the gacha market, because the gacha market is already incredibly oversaturated. There are hundreds of games competing for your attention, and if your game feels like a slightly different version of everything else, why should people stay? A game needs to have an identity, it needs to know who it is for, and I think this is where having a core audience becomes extremely important. If you try to make a game appeal to absolutely everyone, then every decision you make has the potential to upset somebody. You change something to satisfy one group and another group gets angry. You change it back and the first group gets angry again. But when a game has a more focused audience, the developers can make more specific decisions. They can understand what their audience actually wants. And if they make a mistake, that audience may be more willing to wait for them to fix it, because they understand what the game is trying to be. They have a reason to care about the game. A game with a strong identity can make mistakes. A game without an identity can become completely interchangeable. The trade-off. And I think this is ultimately what the entire debate comes down to. I'm not saying that choosing your protagonist is inherently bad. For many players, that choice is extremely important. Representation matters, immersion matters, and some people simply prefer playing as a character that matches their own gender. That's completely understandable. But remember that choice always comes with a trade-off. The more freedom you give the player to define the protagonist, the less freedom the writer may have to define that protagonist themselves. The more versions of the protagonist you create, the more carefully the writers have to make the personality work for them. The more flexible the protagonist is, the more flexible the relationships have to become. And the more you try to make the game appeal to everyone, the more difficult it becomes for the game to have a specific identity. And that's why I think a single protagonist can sometimes be more interesting than a protagonist you get choose. Because when the writers know exactly who their protagonist is, they can make better decisions. They can give them more personality, they can give them specific flaws, they can create relationships that actually mean something. They can make choices that not every player in the world will like. And that is okay, because a character does not need to be designed for everyone to be interesting. In fact, most times the opposite is the truth. The more a game tries to make its protagonist belong to everyone, the harder it becomes for that protagonist to feel like they belong to anyone. So maybe the problem isn't that gacha games give us too much choice. Maybe the problem is that sometimes giving the player more choices means taking choices away from the writers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think. Do you prefer choosing between a male and female protagonist? Do you think it makes the story worse? Or do you think the benefits of player choice are worth the trade-off? And if you think there is a better way for games to handle these problems, let me know as well. You can also join our Discord, we are daily active, and I'll see you in the next video.